turn our attention now to Acts chapter 18. And over the next few weeks, actually, through this month, we're going to spend some time in the book of Acts. And where we find ourselves in the story is we are nearing the end of the Apostle Paul's second missionary journey. And so we have tracked with him into Europe for the very first time that he has set foot on what is now European soil. He landed first in Philippi. And if you remember, there's a story of the Philippian jailer who was converted, Lydia, who was converted down by the river. And so this all happens, but then Paul leaves Philippi after some undue process with officials in the city. And after he leaves there, he heads to Thessalonica, where the gospel gains a foothold, but he is quickly run out of the city. He heads to Berea, and the Bereans were a little more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the message of Paul. They diligently searched through and tried to understand if what he was saying was in congruence with the scriptures, and many in Berea believed. And then in the fall of 49 AD, so that's kind of where we are in the historical timeline, he leaves Berea after some Jews came from Thessalonica, which has been a pattern, by the way. If you've noticed, he'll preach in a city, and he goes to another city, and then some Jews from the previous city follow him there eventually, and they start to agitate and stir up crowds, and then Paul has to leave and go to another city. And so he has this kind of continual following, not of the good kind, of the agitating kind that seems to keep putting on pressure and running him out of town. And so Paul then ends up in Athens, although Silas and Timothy stay in Berea. And we actually think that Timothy probably went back to Thessalonica at some point in the process as well. But anyway, Paul is in Athens, and in Athens he sees that the city is full of idols. He preaches in the synagogue, he preaches in the marketplace, he reasons with people at the Areopagus. There's lots that he does in that city, but he doesn't stay in Athens long either. And what happens at the end of his time in Athens is that he then moves on to Corinth. And so that's where we pick up the story in Acts chapter 18. So this is what it says. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, and recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all of the Jews to leave Rome. And so let me just pause there for a second. So he leaves Athens and goes to Corinth. Now, Corinth is the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, which is on a major seaport. Corinth is. It is a kind of a big place for seafaring vessels. Lots of merchandise travels through there. There's all kinds of things that happen in Corinth. But Corinth also has a reputation as a city. And this isn't just kind of what we get from the scriptures. This is a general historical reputation that the city of Corinth has. Well, what is it? Well, Corinth was what we might say the sin city of that day. It was well known for its immorality, and for lots of immoral people living there, and lots of immorality happening there. Even among Gentiles, it was known as the immoral city. And so Paul ends up in Corinth, and while he's there, he finds a Jew named Aquila. And with him is his wife Priscilla. Now, Aquila and Priscilla are a couple that show up later in the chapter, and we'll get to that another Sunday with an interesting story with them and Apollos. But it's here in Corinth that Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla. Now, Aquila and Priscilla show up in 3 different places in the New Testament. And in fact, one of the places, it actually says that Aquila and Priscilla risked their necks for Paul. And so they become kind of a champion of his missionary journey, and we might even say good friends of his along the way. And so Aquila and Priscilla are in Corinth. But why is this Jewish couple in Corinth? Well, because Claudius, who was the Roman emperor at the time, had expelled all of the Jews from Rome. He asked them to leave. Now, why is that? History is a little bit uncertain on the exact reasons. There seem to be maybe some underlying tones of exactly why he did it. But at this point, he had asked all the Jews to leave Rome because of ongoing civil disturbances that were happening. And some suggest that those civil disturbances that were happening in Rome among the Jews were because of the message of Jesus had arrived in Rome. And as we've seen in many of the other places in Acts, when Paul goes and preaches to the Jews, there was some upheaval and some agitation. Well, this was happening in Rome too. And by the way, Paul has not yet been to Rome, but the gospel has made it to Rome. Isn't that interesting that we figure that out through this? And so there's this agitation that's happening. It was enough for Claudius to tell all the Jews to leave, and so Aquila and Priscilla left Rome, perhaps simply in obedience, perhaps out of fear for their lives, whichever it is they leave, and they end up in Corinth. And this is where they are. And so Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla there. And so he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, because their trade was what? Tent making. They were tent makers. That was their trade. That's what they did, and so was Paul. And so he was there with them, and they found this support together. And so both of them, all three of them, they were working with their hands. We read oftentimes where Paul would even refuse support from certain churches so he wouldn't be a burden on them, and he would work with his own hands and support himself. He was bivocational as a missionary, as it were. That's part of what he did. And so here he is making tents. Now, I think perhaps part of the connection with Aquila and Priscilla, and part of what happens with him kind of going back to the trade for some time, and this is just me as an aside, just kind of reading through and thinking it through. It's not explicitly stated in the text, but I think Paul is waiting for Silas and Timothy to arrive. Like, he knows that they're going to eventually catch up with him, even though they were left in Berea, but they haven't done that yet. He's been on his own for a bit. He's also been run out of town in one place and then left Athens, and now he's in Corinth. And I don't know, but I wonder if perhaps he was feeling a bit worn out. There's a lot going on this missionary journey. I wonder if even perhaps he might have been a little bit discouraged along the way. And so Paul goes back to doing some tent making while he's there. He meets Aquila and Priscilla. Perhaps it is a time for him to rest and recover. But we discover that it does not last too long, if that is indeed the case. Why? Because when we get to verse 4, it says, "And then he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks." In verse 5, now this is where it gets really interesting, Silas and Timothy arrive from Macedonia eventually. And Paul was occupied at that point with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. This is not an uncommon thing that we found all along. This is what he was preoccupied with on most of his missionary effort. He would start with the Jew first and to the Gentile next. And so Silas and Timothy, who were in Berea, and again, we think that Timothy, reading between the lines, must have gone back to Thessalonica to check on the church there, and then both of them eventually end up in Corinth. They show up. Paul is likely refreshed, glad to see them again. But when they show up, they discover that Paul is occupied with the evangelistic fire that he always carried. And this fire had kind of been fanned into flame again. It had returned. And here he is speaking with the Jews about Jesus and telling them about how he is the Messiah, the one they've waited for. But when he does, what do they do? Again, he's met with something he has become accustomed to. He is met with opposition. And when they opposed and reviled him, it says, this is not only that they resisted his message, not only did they oppose what he had to say, they reviled him. What is that? That is that they vilified him with abusive and insulting language. It wasn't just, we disagree, politely. No, we don't think you're right. We think your message is inadequate. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody is raised from the dead. No, respectfully, you've lost your mind. That's not what's happening. There's an opposition and a, well, I probably won't say some of the words that might have come up. They insult him and are abusive in their language. And so what does he do? He shook out his garments. What is that? Well, if you recall back when Jesus sent out some of the disciples, he said, go and preach the good news of the kingdom in all these towns and heal diseases. And he gave them the authority to do these things. And so when they went, Jesus said, when you get to a place, and if they refuse to let you enter a house, and if they refuse to hear the message, and if they refuse what it is that you're saying, he says, shake the dust off of your feet or your sandals and do what? Go to the next town. Like shake the dust up. And this is the kind of thing. He shook out his garments, and that's not meant to be an insulting thing. It's just simply a way of showing that, hey, the work here and what I've come to do and what I've done my best to proclaim and to tell and to speak and to reason and all the rest, and yet you refuse to listen, and so it is time for me to move on. And this was just a practical sign that was happening. So he shook out his garments and he said, your blood will be on your own hands. I am innocent because I've told you everything that you need to know and you refuse to believe. And so from now on, he says, I will go to the Gentiles. In other words, I am shifting my focus somewhere else. Now, again, this was not an uncommon practice. He would always go, when he came to a city to preach, he would go first to the synagogue to reason with the Jews, and then from there, next to the Gentiles. And I wonder if perhaps Aquila and Priscilla, because of maybe what they had experienced in Rome, might have been helpful to Paul, even at this point, if he was discouraged. Again, that's not in the text, but I wonder. And so Paul shakes out his garments. Now, again, as I said, it's not to be interpreted as hatred or a means of revenge or a way of insult. It simply means he's made every effort to convince them of the message of Jesus. But it has been continually resisted, and they've even become hostile toward Paul, and so he's moving on. And could I just say, there is a time for us to move on. I know we might not like the thought of that, or that might sit, it's like, but yeah, but what about, and our minds might race ahead, and yeah, but when is the right time to move on? It's not always easy to figure out when is the right time to move on, but there is a time for moving on. I mean, you've shared the message, you've attempted to reconcile with the person, you have done your best to live at peace with them, but the response has been continual rejection, and sometimes it has become hostile, and there is a time to leave things in the hands of God and to move on. If you turn to Romans chapter 12. You don't have to turn there, I'll read it for you. There's a verse in Romans 12 toward the end of the chapter. And Romans 12 is very much about how do we live out the practice of the gospel, or the reality of the gospel. How is it that we live our lives as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God? What is the natural expression of that? Practically, how does that look? And when we get down to verse 18, after a long list of things, this is what the Apostle Paul says. He says, if possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with everybody. Not just the people you like and you gather yourself around, or who invite you to places. It's not just, no, it's live peaceably with everyone as much as it depends on you, which means that there's a part of peace that depends also on them. And so as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. But sometimes there's a time for moving on. And it doesn't mean you close every door and that you never engage or talk to or try to, again, reconcile or bring peace. But sometimes you hold that door open from a distance. And so here he shakes out his garments and he says, I've done everything I can. I'm going to move on to the Gentiles. So then now hear this. Verse 7, it says, and he left there, and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, which, by the way, indicates that he is Gentile or Greek, not Jewish. Okay? And he goes to Titius Justus's house, which was next door to the synagogue. Are you picking up on that? Okay, so he goes next to the synagogue, and Crispus, okay, so Titius Justus has been a welcome place for the message, and it's right next door to the synagogue, so it was a little bit awkward perhaps, but here's what's even more awkward, not only that he's gone next door to the house of somebody who lived near the synagogue, but Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. What is the ruler of the synagogue? He gave leadership to the synagogue, he oversaw services, he would be the one who would maintain the scrolls, and he would pull them out for the various times in which they would be read. He might have even been responsible for some of the maintenance of the actual synagogue itself. He was the ruler, the leader, the one responsible and in charge of the building and the place and the function and all of the things. And Crispus, who was a ruler of the synagogue in the very place where Paul's message was opposed, Crispus believes in the Lord, together with his whole household. And many of the Corinthians, on hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. This, again, is the normal pattern we find in the New Testament. They believe first, and they are baptized after as an expression of that belief. And so we have people in Corinth who now, not everybody in this synagogue opposed and reviled. There were a few who believed the message. And so in Corinth, we have the beginnings of a church of both Jews and Gentiles. But here's one of the things, again, I think that Paul now is, again, wrestling with what his next move is, just because of some of what is said here. He's wrestling through, now where do we go? We've gone to the Jews, we're coming now to the Gentiles, and how does that look, and what's the plan, and what's the strategy, and where do we start, and who do we talk to, and all as that mindset shifts, he realizes that God is at work, that there are new believers in this place, but there is also, I assume, some amount of fear because of the opposition that he has faced in that city as well, and if this has been the pattern of what's happened before, we've seen all throughout, he would not be long in a place before he would be run out of that city too. And I wonder if in the back of Paul's mind, he is thinking, it's not going to be long, and we're going to be on to the next place because this is going to kind of all blow up again. And then we read in verse 9, then the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. Why? Because I am with you. Not because your strategy is going to work. Not because you have this great ability to persuade people. Not because somebody's going to work in your favor. No. Paul, don't be afraid to speak. God intervenes with clear direction for Paul. Keep going in the city. Why? Because I am with you. The presence of God is what matters most, not his success by any measure he might measure it by. So God has given him Aquila and Priscilla. God has given him Silas and Timothy back. God has given Titius Justus. He's given him Crispus. He's given probably someone else named, that's named ends with US. It all rhymes, maybe. I don't know. But there are many in the city. And so what does he say? Look, there are many. No one's going to attack or harm you, Paul. I have many in this city that are my people. You don't see it yet. You don't realize it yet. Perhaps some of them have not even received the message yet. But Paul, you must know that I know that there are many more in this city who are my people. And I'm telling you, Paul, don't be afraid. Keep going. Stay where you are. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to fear. I'm going to be with you. And you need to stay in the city and keep doing what you are doing. And so how long did he stay? He stayed another year and 6 months. Now we might say, well, that's not very long. 18 months is all he stayed after that. But that's the longest he stayed in one place to date. In fact, through all of his missionary journeys, it is only the second longest time he stayed in one place. It's only surpassed by one other spot that was in Ephesus on his third missionary journey where he stayed for 2 years. As a missionary, as one who brought the gospel to new places, as one who blazed the trail into new territory, as one who would come into a place and preach and proclaim and establish a church and then do the next thing in the next town, to stay another year and 6 months for Paul was a long time. Now fast forward again to the end of those 18 months. That's where we pick it up in verse 12. Here's what happens. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, that is a governing official in a Roman province, he was the head of the government in one of those provinces. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. That is, that they organized themselves and built a legal case around Paul in order to try and stop him. And they brought it to the proconsul, and this is what they said. This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. That is their interpretation of the scriptures. And so for the Jewish people, this was not just a matter of religious debate. This was legal debate. For the Jews, the law was the law. It wasn't just the law of God in a spiritual sense. It was the law of God that we follow as a people and as a nation. And we are here to enforce the law and make sure the law is carried out. And this guy is doing things contrary, at least in our opinion, to the law. Verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth to defend himself, Gallio spoke up, the proconsul, and he says to the Jews, look, if this was a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. In other words, if there was some criminal action here, if he'd done something illegal, if this was not some kind of internal religious debate, I might do something about it. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. In other words, I am not going to help you figure this one out. You might think you've built a case and you've brought it to me to bring judgment and to rule on it, but I refuse to do so. You guys need to figure it out yourself. In camp language, we'd say, that's not my monkey. And so what happens? Verse 16. And he drove them away from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, who is the new ruler of the synagogue, since Crispus now had believed the message and was no longer the ruler of the synagogue. It's the new guy that's there, Sosthenes. He's the ruler of the synagogue. And they take Sosthenes, who is likely the lead accuser on the case, who has apparently failed in his attempt to bring Paul to justice in their eyes. They took him and they beat him up in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of it. He turned a blind eye. Now, as an aside, by the way, while there's no explicit connection made in the New Testament, it's possible that this same Sosthenes is the same Sosthenes that's mentioned later as a co-author of the first letter to the Corinthians, along with Paul, which would speak to his later conversion. What an interesting turn of events, if that is the case. And so while there are sometimes reasons for us to move on, we discover here that deciding to stay made the difference. Deciding to stay made the difference in Corinth. So let me put this in a bit of a pastoral context. I know it's different from the missionary context, but I want to take us to a pastoral context and then to another context as well. But let me just kind of do that. I was sitting some time ago in Tim Hortons in Barrington. I'm sitting at the chair, and I got my laptop out, and I was working on a few things. I was probably waiting for the kids to be done school and pick them up, and had to go down for some reason. So here I am sitting there, and it's not too busy in Tim Hortons that day. And then this group of ladies come in, and they had got their coffee and their whatever they had, and they had come and they'd sat down at a table like just across almost the aisle from me, like, you know, they were less than 10 feet away. And these 3 or 4 women were sitting around the table, and they were talking, you know, fairly loudly, and I wasn't eavesdropping, you know, like Samwise Gamgee, I ain't been dropping no eaves, you know, from Lord of the Rings. Anyway, it's a whole other, never mind. But I wasn't eavesdropping, but it was really hard not to hear what they were saying. And one of the women was talking, and everybody around the table was very much in agreement. Yes, this is so true. One of the women was saying, I don't know why that pastor is still here. I'm trying to think, like, what church are they talking? That was where my mind went to first. I was like, no, I don't recognize any of you from Argyle, so that's a first step. I don't know why that pastor is still here. Pastors should not stay at a church more than 3 years. I think 3 years is the max that they should be there. And after that, they've overstayed their welcome. Pastors should not overstay their welcome in a church. It's just not good. 3 years, that's it. They should move on to somewhere else and let us get a new one. That was the conclusion. And I didn't know whether to laugh or be sad or say anything or not say anything, so I just carried on with my typing, thinking about that for the rest of the day. On another note, when I was home, I've seen this a couple times when I was home, but I saw this picture. I took another picture when I was home again in July for my parents' anniversary. I know you can't read any of this, but this is a framed, handwritten, kind of a beautiful piece, actually. It is the record of the United Baptist Church in Victoria Corner, which is a small community near Heartland. MBBI is right there, if you're familiar with that. Victoria Corner Baptist Church is actually a sister church to the church I grew up in, which was the Waterville United Baptist Church. There's 2 churches on the field, so the pastor pastored both congregations. And so the Victoria Corner United Baptist Church has this very long history, and I think if I'm looking at it, there were 2 church buildings that were destroyed by fire over the years. And then they built the 3rd church building, which was dedicated on June 26 of 1898. One of the fascinating things about this is if you look at it, it says the dedicatory services were preached by 3 preachers at the dedication service of the new building, the newest in 1898. Reverend Joseph McLeod, Reverend J.B. Daggett, and Reverend William DeWare, who is my great-great-grandfather, Free Baptist minister, who actually chaired one of the early assemblies of what is now the CBAC in New Brunswick one year. So just kind of a fascinating piece of family history for me. It's also the church in which I'm pretty sure I preached my first sermon. So kind of an interesting thing. Anyway, if you look, it says minister serving the present church, beginning with Reverend T.C. DeWitt in 1898. And it goes all the way down to 2010, at which time I'm pretty sure was the year that the church finally closed its doors. So we have this long list of preachers, pastors who served in that church from 1898 to 2010. There are 42 pastors on the list, over 112 years, which averages to 2 years and 8 months per pastor. They did not overstay their welcome. The longest on the list is 8 years. Some of them were 6. Most of them are 4 or less. Why did I bring that up? I find that fascinating myself. And I know that the reasons for leaving sometimes vary. But I also know, and know enough pastors, that when ministry gets hard, sometimes pastors will say, God has called me somewhere else. Sometimes that's the case. And sometimes I think that actually is the case. There is a time to move on. There is a time to go somewhere else. That can be true of any profession, of any vocation. Sometimes there is a reason to go. And sometimes, however, God has called me somewhere else is an excuse to simply not stay because of whatever reason. Issues, conflicts, pick your thing. It's less often, at least in my experience, that you hear a pastor say, God has called me to stay. Through whatever the pain it is, through the circumstances to be present, because God has a purpose for us and for me. And here's what I find the interesting thing is that Paul, while there was a time for him to move on from the synagogue, it was also a time for him to remain in Corinth for the second longest time he ever stayed anywhere to preach and to teach. Those 18 months helped establish the church in Corinth. And if you know the story, and if you've ever read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you would know that the ongoing relationship with the church in Corinth was long and bumpy. There were hard things. They dealt with hard things. There was lots of difficulty, and yet he persevered with them. And I think there's something about longevity, not only in ministry, but let me start with that context. There's something about longevity in ministry that amplifies the impact when there are healthy leaders in place. Like, it's not just that longevity is the most important thing. It's not just that if somebody stays in an area for a long time, then that automatically means that good things will come and all of the rest. But longevity does provide a sense of consistency. Longevity provides some stability in a changing world. Longevity provides a sense of trust that's built through relationship with proximity to one another. Longevity helps with spiritual formation that takes place over time. Longevity is very helpful, and deciding to stay can make a huge difference. And while there is a time for moving on, let me just kind of push this a little bit further for you. Your decision to stay might be the thing that makes the difference. To stay where? Well, to stay in your job, perhaps. Maybe you have a reputation in your workplace, or among the people that you serve, or within the community of the people that you serve. Maybe you have a reputation that over time will yield all kinds of benefits and fruits. Staying in your own community with the relationships of your neighbors and those around you really has an impact on the kind of community that gets built, does it not? When you stay within your church, or even when you serve within the church in a particular ministry over a long period of time, there's something about the longevity of that amplifies, has the potential at least to amplify the impact of you serving in that place, in that role for a long time. And again, that's not to say that there aren't times. I think I've tried to give you that balance, right? Sometimes there are times to move on, but there are other times when staying is what makes all the difference. And a lot has changed over the years in our lives, in your life, in my life. Many of you have been around a lot longer than me, maybe a little bit longer than me, however long, okay, some of you not as long as me, but we have seen changes, not just in the church, but in the community, in the world. Like, the world has changed, but the God we read about in Acts chapter 18 has not changed. And he still has people in the community. And so we must not be afraid to continue to preach the good news of Jesus, to tell others of the love that he has for them. Why? Not because perhaps we can measure success by how many people show up, because success isn't about how many people show up, it's about the kind of people that leave. Right? When we walk out the door, it's not about how many are here on the Sunday, it's about what are the kind of people that leave after we've heard this word, and how has God shaped and formed us to be salt and light in our world. And so what we look to is the God who has entrusted us with the good news of the gospel, and to not be afraid to trust and follow him. And that we can go and do that with the confidence that he is with us. Let me pray for us, and then we'll gather around the table this morning. God, we thank you that you are good. We thank you that you have placed us in this community, and to be here for these times and these days, and for the reasons that perhaps even you know and we don't. But God, we pray that through our continued and ongoing faithfulness to you, that as we gather in this place to be your people, to worship, to be shaped and formed by your word, as we live in this community and interact with our neighbors and the people we do business with, and God, as we, even in our own houses, within our own families, God, as we seek to be salt and light in all of these places, God, help us to have a boldness and a confidence and a courage to know that you are with us in everything. The things that are hard, the things that are difficult, the times when we feel like giving up or throwing in the towel or calling it quits or moving on to somewhere else. God, you are with us in those things. And God, you have a purpose and a plan to form not only in us, but to accomplish through us to all that you have called us into. And so help us to have the courage. Help us to have the courage to do what is good and pleasing to you. Help us to know your presence with us as we seek to be faithful in all the things that you have entrusted us with, we pray in Christ's name.